They had some friends, worked out perfectly. They had friends in the Milwaukee Roundtable. And then they're going to, after they see us, they're going to actually go to St. Joseph's Roundtable also. So they're making a lot of acquaintances and meeting a lot of people at these roundtables. So Carolyn is a retired high school administrator and independent historian, and she speaks on a variety of American history topics. She was also the Civil War Trust's Teacher of the Year in 2003. And tonight she's going to talk about her first book, and it couldn't be a better time with us coming up to our Gettysburg tour in a couple months. She's going to talk about We Fought at Gettysburg, and it's going to be the firsthand accounts of some of the survivors of the 17th Connecticut Infantry. So please let's give it a warm welcome to Carolyn Ivanoff.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. This?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And thanks for having me. And I should have remembered that Mary Abra was a member of the Roundtable. And I'm sorry to miss her because she is a big supporter of the Civil War or the American Battlefield Trust Teachers Institute. And I've met her there many times over the years. So you have wonderful members here. I recognize several of you from the Civil War Congress. And again, thank you for having me. So today we're going to talk about a lot of firsthand accounts that were written by this Connecticut regiment. Many of them have never, ever been published. And I put them together in this book called We Fought at Gettysburg. And what I did for this program was I took 12 men out of the book. I'm going to tell you their stories. And we're going to bring their sacrifices and experiences up to the 21st century and relate to you why the Civil War is still so important to us today. You know, war is the worst experience in the human condition, yet it brings great social, technological, and medical advances. And for this, we must be thankful for the men who made these sacrifices for us. And this is the book. I have some here, lots and lots of pictures. And, you know, I always say the past speaks to us with many voices. And we're going to be looking at history tonight from the bottom up. We're not looking at the commanders. We're not looking at the great men. We're looking at these citizen soldiers who really have something to say to all of us. I think we can learn a lot from these individuals. We're going to tell stories about people like us. One of the things that they tell us in their accounts that takes many people by surprise is the fact that, you know, these guys come onto the battlefield debilitated. They are thirsty. They are hungry. Many of them are impaired from the forced marching, some of the greatest forced marching of the war. And once the battle begins, there's little water, no supplies, except for ammunition. There's little to no food, and many of them, perhaps 50% of the Army of the Potomac, 50% of the Union Army has marched right out of their shoes, is going to go through the Battle of Gettysburg barefoot. Now, that's not something that we associate at all with the Union Army. But I know this because these men tell us this in their accounts. Now, Kent Masterson Brown just, a couple of years ago wrote a great, great biography of General Meade. And he went through the quartermaster reports and requisitions at the National Archives. And he verified this. Now, Kent Masterson Brown's writing from the position of the commanding general. And we're looking at what these guys who have to bear this hardship say to us. 50% approximately of the Army of the Potomac goes through the Battle of Gettysburg without shoes. Now, I was just in Iron Brigade territory last night, and here's a quote from Rufus Dawes. He says, "Our men have become ragged and shoeless. Thousands have marched for days barefoot over the flinty turnpikes." That's a 6 Wisconsin man right there. And he is saying the same thing that these guys are saying. You know, you might look at this book and say, well, that's a Connecticut book, or that's not my regiment. But these guys are so emblematic. They are the everyman of the Army of the Potomac. And what they write about, thousands like them, men like them, experienced. So I think they do have something to tell us. So we're going to jump ahead, and we're going to, we all know, and I know you guys know this probably better than most audiences, that on June 28th, Joe Hooker gets fired, and General George Gordon Meade is in command, June 28th. Now, Meade knows there's a battle brewing, doesn't know where it's going to take place, but he's got to get ready for it. And so, as a commanding general looking to win a battle, the first thing he says is ammunition, artillery, and infantry ordered to the front and given priority. And all other baggage, medical supplies, go to the rear. Now, Jonathan Letterman, who we consider the father of battlefield medicine, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, is immediately alarmed and tries to salvage this situation, this impending human disaster, by creating a reserve supply train. However, when the battle does erupt in a meeting engagement on July 1st, most medical supplies, in fact, almost all medical supplies, are 20 miles away in Westminster, Maryland, and will not be brought up to Gettysburg until after the battle is over. So you talk about hardship and crisis in the making. Now, despite this supply situation, Letterman has already created protocols to increase survival for the wounded. Some of the things that he's done, he's trained an ambulance corps that answers to the medical department, and he's revolutionized evacuation procedures. He instituted a 3-tier triage system for evaluating and sorting the wounded into 3 categories to improve survival, still used today: mortal wounds, slight wounds, and surgical cases. Letterman creates these protocols for forward first aid stations, long-term recovery hospitals, and the evacuation and treatment systems based on his protocols altogether are referred to as the Letterman system. And they are cutting edge during the Civil War. During the war, these protocols improved treatment of the wounded, increased survival rates, and we still use them today in the 21st century for all mass casualty situations. So that's the implication. Battlefield medicine, one of them, for our 21st century. That Letterman system created during the Civil War, the procedures of triage, evacuation, emergency care are still utilized today in mass casualty situations for a reason, because they work and they increase survival. Now, you guys are getting ready to go to Gettysburg. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You're all familiar with the lay of the land. On each side of the slide, there are 2 modern pictures. The first is the 17th Connecticut Monument on Barlow's Knoll. It is erected in 1884 by the survivors. It is said to mark the place where their beloved Colonel Moore is immediately killed by 2 shots to the head. And next to that, you see the flagpole. And the flagpole was erected a year after the monument in 1885 and is said to mark the place where Lieutenant Colonel Fowler was horrifically killed in front of his men during hand-to-hand combat when a shell decapitated him spectacularly. None of the men who will survive this experience will ever forget this. So on the opposite end of the slide, we see the shaft that marks the 17th Connecticut position, we think, on East Cemetery Hill. And they're going to they're going to participate in the night fight. Scott Mingus was here last month, I believe. He writes a great book called The Louisiana Tigers, and the Louisiana Tigers are going to be attacking the position on East Cemetery Hill that the 17th Connecticut is going to help repel that attack. In both positions, the 11th Corps is outnumbered. On Barlow's Knoll, you know, I don't like numbers because they're a slippery slope. You'll always get somebody argue with you. On Barlow's Knoll, the Union guys are probably outnumbered 3.5 to 1. And on East Cemetery Hill for that night fight, probably outnumbered 2.5 to 1. So remarkable, I'm going to say iron nutmegs, and hardly at all Howard's cowards or the Flying Dutchman. A slander that comes from the Chancellorsville campaign that is not deserved in the least. And I think we're starting to see, looking at some of these firsthand accounts and some of the new scholarship, we're starting to debunk those slanders. There are 3 woodcuts, contemporary woodcuts in the middle of the slide. Look, I'm not going to go through them, but the reason I put them there is because on the Gettysburg battlefield, you can stand in many different places and see the sight lines, see what the soldiers saw in 1863. Well, unfortunately, if you follow the 17th Connecticut, none of their positions today bear any resemblance to what the men saw in 1863. So I know you're taking your trip there, and you know, hopefully you'll go stand on East Cemetery Hill, and you'll remember that night fight. We'll talk a little more about that, and of course Barlow's Knoll. So you know, battle brings casualties. The casualties at Gettysburg are going to be horrific that first day, especially for the 11th Corps and the 1st Corps, the only 2 corps on the field on that first day. And for the 11th Corps, immediately a hospital system is going to have to be developed. The upper left, you're going to see the Almshouse complex. That's going to become one of the first 11th Corps hospitals because it's directly in line with the retreat toward town that the Union men are going to take after they begin to be overwhelmed on Barlow's Knoll. So you have the Almshouse. The Almshouse went down in, I think, 61. It finally was demolished. It was the poor farm, the county poorhouse, series of buildings. And it was pretty much where the Ag Center is today on the Harrisburg Road. So if you go there and you stand on Barlow's Knoll, you can approximate where it was located. There are 2 other buildings that are still there today. The Dutch Reformed Church on Stratton and High Street on the corner there, and the school, the public school next to the church on High Street. The park has just done a beautiful job refurbishing the Benner farm. the house and the barn, which is across the creek. You cannot see them from Barlow's Knoll today. Okay, they're totally obscured by the foliage. They are on the Harrisburg Road. The barn in the center and the farm in the center is the George Spangler Farm. It becomes the 11th Corps Hospital, or the collection place, to consolidate all of these wounded and then begin to transport them out of Gettysburg. Gettysburg is about 2,400 inhabitants, men, women, and children. When the armies end their fighting on July 3rd, they leave behind approximately 24,000 wounded. That's 10 wounded for every man, woman, and child in Gettysburg. Every barn becomes a hospital. Every house becomes a hospital. All of the public buildings become hospitals. And the first thing that they're going to want to do when the railroad bridges are replaced about July 7th is begin to evacuate all these wounded out of Gettysburg. Anybody that can be transported, they're going to try to transport them out of Gettysburg to try to, you know, do something with the horrific mess the town is in. Now, what's a hospital? We went through that. It's any place there's shelter and a source of water. You need a source of water. So after the battle, the atmosphere of Gettysburg is overpowering with putrid air polluted by dead horses and dead men, a vast amount of human effluvia, dead human and horse flesh rotted in the July heat. Torrential summer rains on July 4th uncover and expose shallow graves. The hospitals were charnel houses of amputated limbs and maggot-infested wounds, and an atmosphere that was inescapable and intensely palpable. Flies, millions of them, blacken the landscape. As early relief workers enter the hospitals, they would have smelled them before they saw them. In fact, you could smell Gettysburg from miles away. Smells of sweat, blood, urine, feces, gangrene, and rotting flesh of human and horses clog the atmosphere, making it too difficult to breathe. Hospitals are loud, unruly, disturbing areas of sensory overload, in addition to the inescapable odors and frightening sights. In their misery and distress, the wounded shout, groan, cry, and scream. And it goes on and on. And when you go by the courthouse on Baltimore on your trip, just remember all of the wounded in that courthouse and in all the public buildings in town. And the cries of the wounded from that courthouse are so terrible after the battle that every afternoon a military band comes and stands on the sidewalk in Baltimore, on Baltimore Street, and plays these patriotic airs, one, to elevate the spirit of these poor wounded men, and two, to drown out the noise of their cries and screams. So think of this when you go through that beautiful town, that quaint little town. This is Dr. Robert Hubbard. He's the medical director of the 11th Corps. He's on Howard's staff. He's also the surgeon of the 17th Connecticut. 36-year-old physician from Bridgeport, Connecticut. He's got a wife and child who are at home. And he winds up being left behind after the battle. And he is one of the surgeons at Spangler Farm. I don't know if you've ever been to Spangler Farm. It's one of the most pristine hospital sites that remains, Civil War hospital sites that remains in America today. Certainly worth a visit if you are there when it is open. You know, I want to talk about surgery in the Civil War. Now, Hubbard's a surgeon. And when we talk about the Letterman system and the advances that the Civil War gives us in the 21st century, we hardly ever talk about surgery. Before the Civil War, most doctors had never treated a gunshot wound. Most doctors had never performed a surgery. Surgery was generally not an option, a medical option or a life-saving option. It just wasn't available before the Civil War for anyone who needed it. After the Civil War, surgery will become commonplace in America. You know, these doctors, these Civil War doctors, are far from butchers. They are good doctors, and it is the war that will make them good surgeons. And by 1863, these guys are not sawbones, because our Dr. Letterman is going to make sure that only the best surgeons are operating on our wounded. If you're not a good operator, as they said in the 19th century during the Civil War, you are going to be doing wound dressing or hospital administration, but you're not going to be cutting on people. And these surgeons, excellent, excellent surgeons, but the tragedy is that the war takes place before Lister and Pasteur begin doing their work. And there is no germ theory. And disease will take 3 times as many men as battlefield wounds. So for four deaths, every 4 deaths in the Civil War, 1 will be from battlefield wounds and 3 will be from disease. Now let's talk about another big Civil War myth. The truth of the matter is that nobody bit the bullet in the Civil War. There were always adequate amounts of anesthesia. And almost every surgery during the war is performed under anesthesia, either ether or chloroform. Obviously, chloroform is preferred because it's not as volatile or flammable as ether. And if you're operating by candlelight or under battlefield conditions, you're not going to explode yourself. There's another issue with regard to the myth of Civil War doctors being surgeons. That is with regard to amputation. There is no doubt that amputation saved lives. And many of these doctors understood that. Because of the munitions, the mini ball, whatever that slow moving 1-ounce slug hit, it would pulverize and destroy on the human body. And so therefore, if you were struck in a limb or anywhere, anywhere was a good wound, a treatable wound, away from the trunk. But these wounds were so devastating, the arms, the legs, the shattered limbs, that Civil War surgeons understood that the only way to save lives was to take a wound that was so devastating it could not be medically treated, to create an amputation that was a simpler wound that could be treated medically and would allow the patient a chance to live. Now, almost everybody got infected, so you had to be strong enough to fight off the infection. But again, these guys are good surgeons. They understand surgery and how to use it. They just don't understand germ theory. Lest we think that we know better than them in the 21st century, all we have to do is think about the wounds that our service men and women are coming back from the battlefields in the Mideast with. How many amputations are we seeing today? How many amputations did we see after the Boston Marathon bombings with those dirty bombs, those pressure cooker bombs that shredded the limbs of some of these victims? Not even modern medicine can deal with this type of wound. And so therefore, we have to think back and understand what these men were doing, what these men went through. And we have to remember that it's the Civil War that makes surgery a practical treatment for Americans whenever and wherever Americans need it. So, surgery, we don't think too much of that. I put this in because, I like this slide because it's interesting when we meet people or we want to tell people about ourselves. It's interesting to contemplate what we tell people and what we remember and what we might forget. This is John Collins. He's an Irish immigrant. He's a 26-year-old Mary laborer from Stamford, Connecticut. He is with Dr. Hubbard the first day on the field as Hubbard is trying to treat the wounded right on the field. And as the Confederate blitz starts to engulf these men, Dr. Hubbard and John, who is responsible for Dr. Hubbard's horse and equipment, is with the doctor. And as the combat heats up, the horses that John is holding rear up, and one of them falls on him and hurts him terribly. And Hubbard comes running and says, "We got to get out of here. Let's get out of here. The Confederates are going to scoop us up." They retreat. They wind up somewhere in Evergreen Cemetery, the civilian cemetery, where Doc Hubbard is going to establish a hospital. And John keeps trying to tell Dr. Hubbard how badly hurt he is. Hubbard's, "I got no time for you now, John." But finally, Hubbard takes a breath and takes a look at this guy and says, "You got to go to the rear. You really have to go to the rear." This is from John's account of his experiences at Gettysburg. I can see it right in front of me, what he writes down to William Warren as he's trying to explain his experiences at Gettysburg. I'm going through the Connecticut papers, 1863, about the Battle of Gettysburg, and I go through the Stamford Advocate, and I'm like, what? Well, seems that Private John Collins was also shot in the chest. He never mentions it in his account. He's got a Catholic prayer book in his pocket that stops the bullet. I mean, the Advocate is very dramatic. It stops on the 199th page. That bullet stops right before the portrait of Christ or something. I don't know. But John never tells me this. Right? Not that I talk to John on a regular basis, but when he writes his account about the battle, he never says this. So the things that they carry during the Civil War, there's so much lead flying. It's amazing. Any of these guys got out unscathed. They're shaking after Barlow. They're shaking bullets out of their clothing and their packs, and it's just incredible. The things that they carried that saved their lives. And I do know for sure, it's documented, that one other 17th Connecticut gentleman is going to be shot in the chest on Barlow's Knoll. And this huge wad of paper he has in his breast pocket is going to save his life. I know this because his friend writes a letter home to his mother on a piece of that paper on July 4th. So the things that they carry, the things that we remember, the things that we tell people about ourselves, I just think it's an interesting story. This is Corporal Aaron Lee. And Aaron Lee makes that first stand on Barlow's Knoll, and he's one of the survivors that gets pushed back. General Ames is going to try to form another battle line at the almshouse. And that gets pushed. And as Aaron Lee is retreating from that, you can see his words up there. As he's retreating from that second battle line, he gets shot in the leg. And he's directed to go to the almshouse. Now, the Confederates are overrunning the field, and all of the wounded become prisoners. Aaron Lee will talk about the friends that he sees die at the almshouse. The Confederates are in control not only of the surrounding areas, but the town itself. And I will say here, one of the hallmarks of the American Civil War is that once a man is wounded, that man becomes a non-combatant. And whoever is in control of the field or the area where this wounded man winds up, whether it's the Confederates or the Union, they will treat the wounded to the best of their ability. So that's one of the hallmarks. There are a few exceptions to that, but by and large, non-combatants are treated medically by both sides to the best of their ability to be cared for. So he gets shot. He's a mess. The Confederates are in control of his hospital. On July 4th, ironically, the 17th Connecticut will come over the field again, their first day's field, and they will liberate these hospitals. Aaron Lee will be sent to Spangler Farm, and from there he will be sent on a railroad car to Philadelphia. And he writes to his father, I remained there at the almshouse a prisoner until July 4th, and from there I was sent to the Spangler Farm. He didn't call it the Spangler Farm, he calls it the 11th Corps Hospital. From there, I was sent to Philadelphia, arriving on the night of the 9th, and then for the very first time, my wound was dressed. Gangrene had set in, and I had a pretty tough time of it. The doctors gave me up and said I could not live, but I did not agree with them. I had made up my mind that I was going to pull through, and I did. And after getting so I could walk on crutches, the doctors wanted to transfer me to the Invalid Corps. But I rebelled, and I got a furlough for 20 days, and through the kindness of Lieutenant Governor Averill, I was transferred to New Haven, Night Soldiers Hospital, and by this transfer, the Invalid Corps was cheated out of a recruit, and I returned to my regiment at St. Augustine, Florida, arriving the 6th of June, 1864. So what is this Invalid Corps that Aaron Lee is going to rebel against and not be transferred to? Well, the Invalid Corps was created by the government for incapacitated or wounded soldiers who could no longer serve active duty to serve out their enlistments. Uncle Sam needs every man, and they're not letting anybody go if they can help it. Uncle Sam is going to term this the Invalid Corps. Well, right there, the soldiers are disgusted by it and don't want to be part of it. Invalid Corps. Well, in the 19th century, the word invalid had connotations of you being identified as an invalid human being. Now, these are farm boys. They have to, they have to work hard. They're mechanics. Nobody wants to be an invalid human being. To add insult to injury, IC is Army shorthand for equipment, deficient equipment that's been inspected and condemned. They start to mock the Invalid Corps as the Cripple Brigade. And Uncle Sam tries to, rebrand it, so to speak, in our 21st century speak. We're going to rebrand the Invalid Corps. We're going to make it more palatable so men want to stay in it, want to be in it. And they call it the Veterans Reserve Corps. And, you know, it's still not very popular, but the Veterans Reserve Corps does really good work for the Union cause. The Veterans Reserve Corps, when Grant strips the city of Washington's defenses of men for the overland campaign, he leaves Washington bare bones. And Jubal Early in 1864 comes knocking on Washington's door. And who's going to defend the capital city? Well, it will be the men of the Invalid Corps. And when they are called out and armed to defend the national capital, the inspecting officer just looks at them in horror. And he says to their commanding officer, "My God, will these men stand?" And the Veteran Reserve Corps officer says, "Well, we can't run away." But they do very, very good work for the Union cause. So, you know, what are the implications for the 21st century? Despite all these negative perceptions, the Invalid Corps is one of the first attempts by the federal government to create an active role for the disabled. And it proved, for the most part, a success. The implications for the 21st century are today our society still continues to grapple with these questions about how best to provide for the disabled, how to eliminate prejudice toward them. Our attitudes toward the disabled, we hope, will continue to evolve. We no longer can consider disabled people invalid human beings. But, hopefully we will continue to create a better world for all those who suffer from disabilities, both seen and unseen. So this is Henry Blakeman. Remember, we said that all the buildings in town, especially the public buildings, are going to become hospitals. Well, Henry Blakeman, let me just explain to you what the odds are on Barlow's Knoll, because he has a very typical experience on Barlow's Knoll. He is with his messmates, his first cousin Celia Blakeman, Henry Blakeman, his best friend Stephen Crawford, and their other friend Sylvester Round. Now they're on the battle line on Barlow's Knoll, they're being surrounded, and suddenly a volley comes at them. Henry is shot in the left side, and he has a gaping exit wound in his back. Sylvester Rounds is shot badly in the shoulder. Stephen Crawford is killed outright, shot in the head. Celia Blakeman is the only one to remain standing. Those are not good odds. Henry is knocked out. He's laying on the ground. He wakes, he finally wakes up to find the Confederates overrunning the field. He becomes a prisoner. The first thing to meet his gaze is his best friend, Stephen Crawford, obviously dead beside him. Believe it or not, this kid can stand up and walk. And so the Confederates get him up, get him going, and force him to walk to a field hospital. When the Confederates are in control of the town by July 2nd, they throw some of the guys from that hospital into a wagon and they haul them into town to the public school, which you see there. And, the sight lines in Gettysburg, I told you, the 17th Connecticut, you really can't see what these guys saw. But from the windows of this schoolhouse, on the night of July 2nd, during that night fight, the wounded prisoners in that building will crowd the windows and they will watch the Louisiana Tigers form up and attack the line on East Cemetery Hill, where the 17th Connecticut is at the bottom of the hill, defending it. And they will be gratified and relieved to see that attack repelled. This is another This is another soldier who's going to wind up in that same schoolhouse. And his name is Justice Silliman. He's a 20-year-old school teacher from New Canaan, Connecticut. And on the first day at Barlow's Knoll, he's shot in the head. And the bullet, it's a nice crease along his skull there, knocks him out. And when he wakes up, the Confederates are swarming the field and he becomes a prisoner. And he also is ambulatory and told to walk to a field hospital. Like Henry Blakeman, he will be loaded into a wagon on July 2nd, hauled into town, and put in the school. He leaves a great account of that night fight, watching that night fight on July 2nd. And on July 3rd, as that barrage, they can't really see anything in town, as that barrage starts to pound to soften up the Union line, and the Union artillery starts to respond with what some people say is the loudest noise on the American continent, the North American continent. Some people or some sources say you could hear it in Pittsburgh. I don't know about that, but that's what some of these old books say. And so all these guys know what's coming. Well, this kid's ambulatory. He's been nursing all of the wounded comrades who are in really bad shape because he's ambulatory. He's trying to help them. He decides to climb up into the cupola you see on that building. It's not there any longer. The building looks beautiful, exactly the same. So good old Justice climbs up into that cupola and he watches Pickett's charge from there. Now, I've done some research about this, and that's not an unusual situation because you have Iron Brigade guys over at the seminary, you know, where they try to get up. They try to get up into the cupola. And a sergeant from the 6th Wisconsin named Sergeant Mickey Sullivan is he's terribly wounded also, shot in the shoulder. He gets a friend. He's at the railroad station, which is also a hospital. He gets a friend to get him up into the cupola at the railroad station so that he can see what he can see. I don't know what you can see down there it's below Baltimore Hill. I don't know what he could see down there. Maybe he could see something, but this is not an unusual circumstance. So what we have here is not only 17th Connecticut guys, but these guys are the everyman of the Army of the Potomac in their experiences. I put this, oh dear. I put this slide, this map here. You're all familiar with this map, but I put it here because the sight lines, you know, were very different. You know, our guys start up on Blocker's Knoll or Barlow's Knoll. They really get creamed. Many of them wind up in the almshouse. You can see it there in the blow up. They make their way into town. Stratton Street is going to be somewhat of an escape route for many of them. Well, Stratton's going to take them to that hospital church and that hospital school. And from that school, the 17th Connecticut is going to form, the survivors are going to form right about here below the hill. And from that school, that's how they're going to be able to watch the night battle on the 2nd. Well, this is Captain Wilson French. And Captain Wilson French is leading his company on Barlow's Knoll. He's got his sword up in the air, his arms up in the air. He's giving orders. He's leading his men on, and he gets clipped by explosive shot, shrapnel, whatever. He is immediately in a very bad way. And he is immediately captured. And he is directed, because he's ambulatory, you know, hold on to your arm, buddy, and get into town. You're a wounded prisoner. Because he's a captain, a private is going to accompany him. And as he makes his way toward the German Reformed Church, this gentleman, Dr. McEwen, is going to meet him in the field, also a prisoner, Dr. McEwen. He's going to slit his coat, going to try to dress his wound. It's not going to be doing much for him, but French does get to the Lutheran Church, the German Reformed Church. At the church, you know, this is the 11th Corps. This is the Dutch Corps, or the German Corps. The doctors are speaking in German, and French is seen. And the doctor says to him, "We're going to take off your arm." He says, "Oh no, you're not. Not taking off my arm." That's usually a death sentence in the Civil War. You don't refuse the amputation. Okay, but French does. His private, Henry Waite, stays with him, treats him with what is called a water dressing, just keeps the wound wet. Everybody gets a water dressing at Gettysburg. Keeps the wound wet. French is transferred to Spangler Farm. And then as an ambulatory wounded officer, look, they got to get these guys out of here. They're like, you're a captain. You're ambulatory. We're going to put you on a train. We're going to give you 20 days leave. We're going to send you home. Let your wife deal with you. So on the 8th of July, he winds up at in Bridgeport, Connecticut at the train station. I don't know how he gets up to Mill Hill, gets himself up there. He's pounding on his door at night. Mrs. French comes downstairs. She doesn't even have a casualty list yet. She opens the door, and there's her husband, full of the mud and the blood right off the battlefield. He's a mess. And he's going to be a mess all summer, and she's going to tend to him. And French leaves an account that when he gets home, he's got to have his boots off. But his boots have not been off he's worn his boots for 14 days up to the Battle of Gettysburg. It's already June 8th. How is Mrs. French going to deal with this? Well, she's going to slit the boots. She's going to try to pull them off his feet. And off comes all his skin and all his toenails. And he is a bloody mess. And this is what these guys are going through. They are suffering. This is the private, Henry Waite. This is the he enlists in 1862 as a private. 16 years old, Bridgeport, Connecticut. He is escaping an abusive and alcoholic father. Dr. Hubbard takes this young man under his wing, makes him like a medical cadet. I don't know, tries to keep him with him. Maybe a lot of his influences during the war made a big impact on him, because after the war, he gets a medical degree. And he's a pretty smart kid, and he starts to invent medical devices. He applies electricity, electrical surgical devices. He forms a company, becomes quite wealthy. A lot of what he's doing we would consider quack medicine, but Henry's pretty committed, and he's a survivor. He lives to have a son of his own, a son that's going to follow in his father's footsteps. Father and son begin to experiment with fluoroscope technology, which is very new, and then they go into X-rays. And it is Henry's son who will invent the portable X-ray equipment that the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, will take to Europe in World War I. And you can see some of those primitive X-rays there and the bullets in the flesh. Look, this is something a Civil War doctor could only dream of. They couldn't peer inside the body to treat wounds. What they did was they probed, first with their finger or a metal rod. They did the best they could. What are the implications for the 21st century? Well, of course, X-rays lead to CAT scans, lead to, PET scans, lead to EEG and, AEDs and all this. The bottom line is Henry's experimenting with electricity in medicine. And some of his stuff you wouldn't want to use today. Yeah. But you have to realize there's no diagnostic medicine in this 21st century without electricity. So all these primitive attempts lead to grand advances that all of us benefit from today. This is Rufus Warren, and he's going to be shot in the left leg on July 1st on Barlow's Knoll, and he is going to suffer an amputation. He's one of those that can't fight off the infection, and he's going to linger until July 17th, where he dies at Spangler Farm. And they're going to bury him in the graveyard, the field at Spangler Farm. Well, Americans want their boys to come home. We don't want our boys laying miles away. We want our dead to come home. And he has an uncle. He has an uncle, this gentleman here, Reverend Hiram Nash, who is going to make a horrific journey, a very expensive journey. You have to be strong. You have to have money. You have to be determined to make your way from Connecticut to Gettysburg and bring home your beloved and honored dead. And there is in the book, I've never seen anything like it before, an itemized list and an account of this horrific journey. What happens is you have to have the dead embalmed. Because at the beginning of the war, they were transporting corpses. You know, the dead always went freight. The dead became freight. They were transporting these unembalmed or poorly embalmed corpses, and they became a nightmare on these trains. There's an account in the book, another journey by another family, and there are corpses leaking all over the freight car. And so what they do is they just throw them off the car. So you can't transport anybody who's not embalmed. So first you go to Spangler Farm and you have somebody identify your loved one's grave. And then you have them disinterred, dig them up. You have to have a special coffin for them. You have to take them to the undertaker or the embalming surgeon. Now, I had an itemized list for this gentleman. And this picture is at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I'm reading this itemized list and I'm like, Dr. Bunnell? I know Dr. Bunnell. Where do I know Dr. Bunnell from? Because there's this huge picture on the wall at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. That is the man who is going to embalm Rufus Warren. And he's doing an embalming there. That's not Rufus Warren, but he is doing an embalming there for, very publicly, just like an amputation. Everything's public, right out in the open. I want to direct your attention to the cost of this. Taking up the body, $1, and this is only a tiny bit of this itemized list. Disinfection, $15. Coffin, $32. So that's $47. And they conveyed him to Dr. Bunnell, who was the embalmer. Then it takes $5 to get him to the express office, and express freight for the body is $23. A total, that just little bit of this, total is $76. And what do I have there? I probably have to get really up to $1 in 1863, or an 1863 dollar is $23.65 in 2023. Big bucks. And again, you had to be pretty strong. So what are the implications? What are the implications for us in the 21st century? Well, it's a civil war that starts to regularize embalming. You know, hey, nobody wants to get the wrong corpse at home. And when my loved one gets home, I want that box opened, and I want to make sure that that's my boy. So the Civil War starts to regularize the practice of embalming. It starts to become a prevalent practice in America. and the embalmer evolves into an undertaker, and funerary practices in America, which were before the Civil War, part of your home life. Somebody died at home, he was cleaned up at home, dressed at home, usually laid out on the bed or in the parlor. That's all within the family. The Civil War is going to change that forever. We don't deal with our dead today. And that practice starts. That business of death being outside the home starts in the Civil War. This is Corporal Alva Wilcox, and he is going to be shot in the shoulder the first day, but that, you know, the way bullets twist and turn, it's going to puncture his lung. And his lieutenant and a couple of his company mates, they're going to roll him in a rubber blanket. They're at the bottom of East Cemetery Hill. Going to roll him in a rubber blanket. They're going to carry him through the cemetery gates. This is from an account I have. And they're going to take him to the hospital in the cemetery. Now, where is this hospital? Probably right out there in the open. Table right out there in the open air, and that's where they're treating people. This kid has what is termed a sucking chest wound. Means he's got a punctured lung. Usually in the Civil War, they would take one look at you and say, put him off to the side, let him go. Not going to even treat him. Well, this gentleman right here in the lower corner, this is Dr. Benjamin Howard. Dr. Benjamin Howard goes to Dr. Letterman and he says, I think we should try to treat these sucking wounds. I have a procedure I want to try. It's called hermetically sealing the chest. And you take, you know, you got a punctured lung, it won't hold air. His idea is he's going to take a bunch of metal sutures. He's going to use all kinds of bandages. He's going to seal it with collodion, and he's going to form a seal. And this is going to give the patient, theoretically, the ability to breathe on his own and perhaps survive. Well, Letterman says, okay, you pick out surgical cases. And he does about 10 of these experimental operations. And this young man is one of them. And it says in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, this case is listed. They do his case right in the field. That to me means they probably operated on him somewhere in that cemetery. All 10 of these experimental surgeries are a failure because it's before germ theory, and all of these men die of sepsis. So the judgment on this procedure is that it has absolutely no effect on mortality and it's discontinued. But what are the implications for the 21st century? These guys who undergo this experimental procedure for hermetically sealing their wounds are only surgical footnotes in medical history, but Dr. Howard's procedure for treating chest wounds ultimately led to a standard practice for successfully treating such wounds. So the tragedy you can't escape, but perhaps the progress makes up for it just a little bit. I don't know. But he's here again because he is going to be, after he has that surgery, transferred to Spangler Farm, where he is going to die. Now, during the Civil War, most nurses, not nurses like we think, during the war, most nurses are wounded or sick men, soldiers, who are assigned, detailed, to nurse. And so you have the wounded and the sick taking care of their more sick and more wounded comrades. And this is the case with Alva. Alva's brother-in-law and good friend, is shot in the face the very first day on Barlow's Knoll. And it is this man who is trying to tend to Alva as he's dying. And I have just a heart-rending account. And so his brother-in-law Alonzo is trying to turn him over. Remember, this guy's shot in the face. He's missing part of his jaw. He's a mess. But he's tending to his brother-in-law. It's a heart-rending story. He's in the process of turning his brother-in-law over when Alva dies in his arms. Well, Americans want their dead to come home. And Brother Charles comes down from Connecticut, and he has Alva disinterred from Spangler Farm. He has him embalmed, and just as he's getting ready to put him on the freight train, the provost marshal says, that's it, no more bodies transferred from Gettysburg. There's not going to be any more bodies disinterred or transferred or freighted. That's it. So Brother Charles has a problem on his hands. What's he going to do? He goes to the civilian cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, and he pulls a burial permit. I have it, the number. And he has a woman, the woman who's keeping the cemetery going while her husband is off to war, Elizabeth. Oh God. I know this is like the back of my hand. But anyway, it's the woman's memorial in Evergreen Cemetery. I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant, and she's got 3 little children. They live in the gatehouse. She's got 2 elderly parents. She usually buries 4 to 5 citizens of Gettysburg a month. After the battle, this 6-month pregnant woman is going to bury 105 soldiers along the elevated area of the Baltimore Pike, where you see there. And many soldiers who die at Gettysburg undergo more than one burial. Most at least 2, some 3. Alva's going to have 3. He's going to be buried at Spangler Farm. He's going to be buried in the civilian cemetery. Charles, I'm bringing my brother home no matter what, is going to come down in January while the ground is still frozen and disease is at bay. He's going to disinter his brother and bring him home to Connecticut. Well, the government doesn't know that because there's a stone for Alva there. What are the implications for 21st century? Well, we still want our boys to come home. But I want to add one thing to that. Remember that brother-in-law that was shot in the face? I've never seen a picture of him. I looked. There's a picture of Alva. There's a picture of his other brother. They're all in the 17th together. Never saw a picture of Alonzo Scranton. What are the implications? I read his medical record. They were pretty brutal. Another first for the Civil War is because of the advances in anesthesia, the Civil War pioneers reconstructive surgery. And what I read from Alva's wounds, he is a perfect candidate for reconstructive surgery. So all these tentacles fit together. And, it's just a tragedy the way the horrors of war decimate so many and yet lead to advances for all of us. I'm going to go through this quickly. This is J. Henry Blakeman. We saw him before. That's his best friend, Stephen Crawford. Henry is the young man that's shot in the side with the exit hole in the back. On July 4th, he gets a piece of paper from Stiles Wells, that young man that was carrying that big wad of paper in his breast pocket that stopped the bullet. And Henry writes one of the most remarkable letters I have read on July 4th, the pouring rain at Spangler Farm, to his mother. And he writes to her, "What I tell you, you can believe. My friend is dead. I know it's going to almost kill his mother, but please let her know. Why is it important that he writes this? Because the Army did not notify families in the event of a soldier's death. There's no central graves registration during the Civil War. There's no formal dog tags during the Civil War. And the Army doesn't notify families in the event of death. And there are estimates almost as high as 40% of the unknown soldiers, North and South, and they're just the vanished for many families who never hear or see of their loved one's fate again. So terrible sacrifices. But Henry is one of the lucky ones. He gets evacuated to Jarvis Hospital in Baltimore, and he writes his sister on July 17th, "Dear sister, last Monday we were brought here. Before we came here, we saw pretty hard times, lying on the ground with only a shelter tent for 5 days. I was wet through and not half enough to eat. I wore the same shirt that I was wounded in, all bloody for 9 days and a half. And that during that time, it was full of maggots. And I wore the same pants till I got here. The Rebs flanked me, but I guess I shall be good for another dig at them yet. Henry." And I maintain after reading this letter that perhaps those maggots saved this boy's life. Maggots, nature surgeons that we still use today, they're sterile maggots for burn victims and wound care today. So Henry's one of the lucky ones. He's a survivor. He's one of what I call the greatest generation of the 19th century. He lives, he comes home to contribute to his community and our state and society. And he holds every public office in Stratford. He's a state legislature. The piece of legislation he's most proud of is closing the saloons on Memorial Day. But, you know, I don't know if you can see him here. He's standing here. He's leading a grand old man, leading the Memorial Day parade in Stratford, Connecticut, 1917. And he's up there and up front. And, you know, this is what a lot of these men are made of. As I said, most nurses are detailed soldiers. This is one of them, George Dickens, and he is a really good man. He's got a pact with his friend John here. Before they go into combat at Barlow's Knoll, they both promise the other that if something happens to one of them, the other will not leave him. And John is wounded badly in the arm, and George gets him over to the German Reformed Church and stays with him. The Confederates are sweeping the hospital, sweeping the streets, picking up stragglers, and they go into the church. And I think they're on to George, and they say to him, you know, "What's wrong with you?" He says, "I'm wounded." Gets a bunch of bloody rags, wraps them around his legs. One of the Confederates said to him, "You know, buddy, take off your traps, take off your equipment, put it in the corner, put a white rag around your arm. We'll leave you here." George does stay there, and he helps nurse the wounded. And he goes to Spangler Farm, and he helps nurse the wounded. And he helps many of these families coming from Connecticut. This is another nurse, soldier nurse at Spangler Farm. His name is James Middlebrook. He's excused from combat by Major Brady. He's a flag bearer the first day, but he's terribly, terribly impaired by what in the lingo of the day is a terrible rupture. He has got a severe hernia. It's hard for him even to walk. The major says to him, "You go to the hospital, you nurse." He writes to his wife on July 9th that he sees these two women volunteers at Spangler Farm. One wears the uniform of her regiment, and the other one is in the American costume, which is a Victorian term for the bloomers, you know, the bloomer costume. You see these two women there. Saying to myself, who could these women be? I mean, can I identify them? I'll never know 100% for sure. You cannot. But I think one of them is Mary Tepe, the vivandière for the 114th Pennsylvania. She's nursing one farm over over from Spangler Farm, and certainly had access to come visit or walk through the Spangler Farm. And the other, I think there's a great possibility that it's Mary Walker, Dr. Mary Walker. She was nursing and volunteering at Gettysburg after the battle. She is the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor. So I think that's a strong possibility for both these women written about in this letter. But that brings me to the whole nurse thing. You know, women do come to Gettysburg. They volunteer. They want to help. They're patriotic. They want to nurse. They want to make a difference, and they do. They are not popular. You do not nurse in the Victorian era. You do not leave your home to touch strange people in the Victorian era. All medicine takes place at home. The doctor comes to your house. He makes a house call. Your mother, your wife, your grandmother, your aunt, they take care of the medical issues within the family. Nobody is a professional nurse. If you get arrested for prostitution before the Civil War in New York City, you get three choices. You can go to prison. Most do. You can pay the fine. Most don't have the money. Or you can work off your sentence as a nurse in Bellevue Hospital. And almost none of them do. But during the Civil War, women break the mold. They go, they leave their homes, they nurse these men. They're not popular with the doctors or with the officers, but with the wounded, they are very popular. And everywhere women go, survival rates rise because women clean, they comfort, they wash, they cook. And everywhere they go during the Civil War, survival rates rise. And the veterans will never forget these women who came to them in their time of need. And after the Civil War in 1873, the first formal nurses training program begins at Bellevue Hospital in 1873. So we all are able to enjoy the comforts and care of female nurses. But that starts in the Civil War. And I have one more slide that I would like to go through. And I want to ask you, has anybody ever heard the term that it will take an act of Congress? Anybody ever heard that term? A few people are nodding their heads. Well, you know what? I think that this expression, it will take an act of Congress, refers to the congressional bills necessary for the passage of veterans' pensions. Did you know it took an act of Congress to get a veterans' pension? So, on August 31st, Bridget Roach, whose husband James was 17th Connecticut Company E, died in the regimental hospital in St. Augustine, Florida. Somebody writes to her, she realizes James is dead, and she applies for a widow's pension. I don't find anything. But all of a sudden, I find this bill in 1886, 26 years after she applies for this widow's pension. The bill is H.R. 228, titled For the Relief of James Roach. It's introduced to the first session of the 49th Congress. And it states that James Roach, late Private Company E, 17th Connecticut, and the grounds upon which the claim for relief is based are as follows: that said Roach at the time of his alleged desertion was insane and not responsible for his acts, and that he continued to be insane until his death on January 6, 1865. And like any good congressional bill, you got to have testimony, right? So they interview his former sergeant, they interview his former corporal, they interview his regimental surgeon. And everybody says James Roach was an okay soldier, but he was a high-strung man. And then Chancellorsville. And after Chancellorsville, on the way to Gettysburg, this guy is a basket case. And after Gettysburg, he's insane. And his corporal has this to say. Corporal Perry says that before Chancellorsville and after, Roach was exhibiting mental derangement and testified his actions at times were not those of a man of sound mind. And during the campaign through Virginia and previous to the Battle of Gettysburg, he believed Roach was of unsound mind. And after Gettysburg and for the rest of his service, Corporal Perry is quoted that his insanity and death were caused by the necessity of his service. Combat drove him crazy. And you know what? What are the implications for us in the 21st century? We will never know what the true sacrifices and costs of war are to so many who do not manifest physical wounds. The seen and unseen costs of war take a tremendous toll on men in every war. War's terrible effects on the mind as well as the body, the effects of post-traumatic stress, the distress of alcohol and addiction in coping with wounds, both seen and unseen, and all of the hidden costs of war are still not well understood by us today. And war is not kind to the human psyche. Wounds that are unseen can be as deep and as terrible as those that are visible. And James Roach Findegrave lists him as lost at war. And so he was with so very many others. So implications for our century today are that we just have to keep trying. We must try to understand. So I hope with this program, I've done a little part in demonstrating that the service and sacrifice of the Civil War generation is relevant and meaningful to our generation today. And may we as Americans remember, honor, and preserve our history. And thank you so very much for having me this evening.
Thanks, Carolyn, for a great talk and giving us a background on the men that served in the 17th Connecticut. Does anyone have any questions for Carolyn?
Yes. Finally, she did. And that was that testimony that I think sealed the deal from those gentlemen, those former non-com officers. Anybody else? I have books here. That's only a little part of the book, and it's a lot of little stories that are pretty easy to read and a lot of photographs. So enjoy your trip to Gettysburg. It's going to be phenomenal. I go there all the time and I never tire of it. In fact, sometimes I live there. Thank you so much.
Please, if anyone wants to buy books, Carolyn's got the books here, and she'll gladly sign them. It was great seeing everyone again in person, especially after last month with the storm. So everyone have a great weekend. We'll look forward to seeing everybody next month. And we're going to be here from now through June. So this is that.